This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to Israel and books and ideas, as well as many other fascinating things, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is David Bilschitz. He teaches law at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. His scholarly interests are quite diverse, as we are about to see, and pertain to constitutional, international and human rights law, among many other things. He is the co-author of a new book entitled Building a Treaty on Business and Human Rights, Contexts and Contours, that was very recently published by Cambridge University Press. Professor David Bilschitz, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Great to be with you.
So let's start off with a rather general question. Can you tell us of some of the instances and examples of how businesses can violate human rights?
Right, so that's a great question because it's really important to understand when we're addressing a legal problem, what is the problem that we're actually seeking to address. So let me start with something that's quite in my mind about I was taken on a sort of field trip around the occupied Palestinian territories, and I saw an example of a business that had been established in the occupied territories, and it was essentially polluting the environment around the business, and it was severely affecting the health of the residences of some of the Palestinian cities such as Tulkarem.
And before you go on, can I just ask you, does it matter if it was an Israeli or a Palestinian business? What was it?
Well, I'm particularly going to say it's important because it's an Israeli business in this case, because you'll see why it's important in this context. So, of course, all businesses should not violate fundamental rights. So in that sense, it doesn't matter because fundamental rights ultimately relate to the individual and the individual's fundamental interests such as health. But essentially, in this particular case, it was an Israeli business, which had actually moved from being within Israel, having violated a number of Israeli environmental standards, into the occupied Palestinian territories because those standards were not applicable, right? And so what you have is a situation where a business was wanting to operate in a way which was actually violative of various human rights, such as the right to health and ensuring people have a healthy environment in which to live. And it moves into a space in which it isn't properly regulated and in which the state which is responsible for that context, and in this case it's Israel as the occupying power, has a responsibility in the occupied Palestinian territories, is not actually fulfilling its duty in order to regulate. What happens in that context, right? And this is the question ultimately that happens of international law, because if it was a question of domestic law, let's say an Israeli business within Israel, Israel would have the obligation to ensure that business is essentially taking care of people's fundamental rights. It does have the obligation elsewhere, but the companies use the fact that there's differences and changes of borders essentially to try and escape proper regulation, right? And then the question becomes, in a context where a state such as Israel does not exercise its authority as it should, for example, in the occupied Palestinian territories, has the business done anything wrong? Is there a way for the people of Tulkarem, for example, who are suffering from various ill effects to get any remedy against the business, right? They're not going to succeed in the occupied territories itself. Israel itself seems unwilling within its own framework to provide a remedy. Is there any other way to provide a remedy? That's the question that this focuses on. And I gave you an example of this context here because we're in Tel Aviv. But of course, this is replicated in many contexts around the world. And today we have very complex structures of business, where business, for example, let's say is headquartered in New York and has many, many different subsidiaries in different places. And then even so, even if you take one place, let's say like Bangladesh, there will be many companies that actually create and manufacture for the main company that occurs in New York. What is the responsibility for the company in New York for the activities, let's say, of a company all the way far away from it that, let's say, uses a child in labor? Right? Or that forces people to work under terrible conditions, or that pollutes, as I gave you an example, right? And how do we address this problem that companies cross borders? And also, when we look at law, they actually are regarded as separate people. So a company in New York is not the same company as a company in Bangladesh, and its supplier will not be the same company as the company in New York.
But
how do we deal with this confusing array of companies?
But why do you need a separate framework? Because these companies, as you said, are normally, or maybe not always, but they have some sort of geographical location and are therefore subject to domestic laws of different states, and therefore the state could be held accountable. And on the other hand, these companies are run by people, right? The CEO or the board of governors or whoever can be held accountable. Why do you need like a separate legal space to address the companies themselves?
Right. Well, the problem comes ultimately in a few reasons, right? The first one lies in the fact that the states, and I gave you that example of Israel, often are not enforcing the laws in the space in which they're responsible. What do you do in that case where the state is itself part of the problem? So we call that the problem of weak governance. So, of course, that isn't the only issue, because you might also land up with new violations of rights, right? And so very much in the news at the moment is Facebook and privacy. And we're in the realm of new technology and new possibilities to affect our very most basic, for example, control of our own personal information. Now, it might be that a state actually hasn't regulated as yet on certain things, and the company actually knows that these are things that affect our fundamental rights, and yet it violates and utilizes the gaps in regulation. Right? What do you do when there's a gap? There's no actual current regulation, and a company's actually done something which it shouldn't really do. Right? So you have this problem also of new ways and means of violating rights. And if you have no real obligations on companies, if you have no real international obligations, it might be that the frameworks of particular states actually fail properly to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point about states because it sort of casts your initial example in a different light, right? Because it's not so unique. In other words, you're saying that countries in general are not so good at regulating businesses from protecting or stopping them from violating human rights. And you call this the weak state problem, but you're clearly not referring just to states with weak governments, right? It's any state, including very strong and stable governments, who have weak interest in regulating businesses. Why is that the case?
Well, it's a very good point. So the problem is particularly pronounced, and we see the worst violations often in areas of weak states, often where people utilize the chaos that is existing to make money and actually play a role in very serious violations.
Like transitional states or conflict societies.
Exactly, etc. But you also have this in general in many, many states. And like you say, often there's a very strong, we call it the sort of state-business nexus. Right. And there's a strong relationship between money and politics. And so what you see happening in many countries that essentially the state doesn't regulate very strongly businesses and actually businesses try and lobby the politicians so that they can actually exploit a number of loopholes that exist.
Just to give a good example, there's a recent book, probably maybe our listeners have heard of it, called Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild, where she talks about the very incredible difficulty of regulating American companies from major environmental disasters because they're happening in states and the federal government won't regulate them, and the senators of those states don't want to protest. And this is a great example, I think, of a very strong state, very stable state that absolutely cannot or doesn't want to. So what's going on?
That is right. And I think it's to some extent got to do foundationally with how business somehow has been seen as a sort of exceptional entity that somehow can do whatever it likes in the pursuit of profit. And it's a very strange idea.
What a concept.
Right? Yeah. Joel Buchan has called it the pathological idea of the corporation, that the corporation is essentially pathological in the pursuit of profit. It can do anything. We would usually regard someone as a psychopath if they acted in that kind of way.
But the thing is, just the word pathological makes it seem like it's out of the ordinary, when in fact this seems like the most ordinary of human pursuits.
It is. And in a sense, business goes back to foundational pursuits of our beginnings in our trade, that we engage in one another in order to swap things that enable us to achieve things. So business does go down to very important foundational interests that we have, and actually is a way of realizing our rights. But somehow what we've done is we've constructed entities, and the corporation is one of those, which in a way, as I said to you before, is a separate person that we think of as somehow some real entity behind which, of course, lies individuals. And somehow that entity doesn't have social responsibilities. If it was any individual, right, we would say, well, if you went and hurt someone else, you have to pay reparation, or you have to, we think of you as a person who has responsibilities in relation to other people. In relation to businesses, often that kind of logic somehow somehow gets abstracted, and it's a strange thing. And so when you, like you said, they have boards of directors, the traditional corporate law has been that directors have to act in the best interests of the company. And the best interests of the company are understood to be the best interests of the shareholders. Now, even if that could involve severe social harms, nevertheless, that could be seen to be the duty of the directors to act in the best interests of the shareholder. And it is this kind of notion of the corporation that myself and a number of other academics are seeking to challenge, right? It has been challenged for a long time. But the challenge is that actually corporations are essentially constructs, which are constructed by legislatures, right, for the purpose of actually achieving social goods, right? We allow corporations to be separate people because they insulate individuals from bearing risk, right? So if you invest in a corporation, you won't go bankrupt if the corporation goes bankrupt. And that then allows you to take a whole lot of risks and to innovate and create all exciting technological things, etc., with a corporation. That creates good social benefits. But the goal of a corporation ultimately was the creation of social benefits. And so we shouldn't forget that. And therefore, in the pursuit of profit, where individuals use the corporate form, they have a duty at least not to harm and in many ways to help create social benefits.
But the weak government is not just weak, it's a selectively weak government because these corporations, especially in America, abide by very strict tax rules, for example, right? And if they don't, they get severely punished for it. So
unless they get loopholes, which
they get
occasionally
sure
happens.
They get loopholes, but still, there's no sort of like pathological fixation on profits when it comes to tax evasion, right? It's a question of the government's will rather than its ability to impose that. Isn't that really don't you see your role as predominantly as campaigning of saying this is equally important as, enforcing tax laws?
Well, that's right. As you've seen recently, for example, in the United States, there has been an attempt to roll back tax law, right? And so those taxes are a very important contribution to the general social well-being. And here there's a saying, well, actually, we're taking away from that joint fund, right? And so, again, that's almost part of the deregulation idea that's taking place, that somehow this crazy idea that happened in the 1980s that somehow by deregulating we will be able, in some senses, there's an economic theory behind it, we'll be able to encourage growth, etc. But of course, we've seen how that can also cause tremendous disaster. Now, what you said is this a kind of campaigning idea? I think it's a corrective. Like I always like to say to people, the idea of business and human rights and being bound by human rights is not anti-business. It's about, once again, creating a corrective between a world that has gone mad in saying somehow that the profit motive can be allowed to create the most basic harms to individuals, to rebalancing and saying, well, of course one is entitled to achieve business, but you have to do that within constraints. And those constraints should be adopted by the entire international community to set a common standard that all countries across the world follow.
But let me ask you, you position this in your book, it seems to me, almost as inevitably a confrontational relationship. In other words, is business and protecting human rights invariably a zero-sum game? I'm just thinking about the sort of Tom Friedman, vision of globalization in life, that businesses were, set to bring the gospel of human rights and workplace standards to the most underdeveloped countries. And it seems like he has a slightly different perspective. Which is the correct perspective on business?
Did you just quote Tom Friedman?
I did.
Well, I think the idea
critically, of course.
The idea is important, right? And of course, I don't think business is necessarily negative for society. Business has huge advantages for society. And part of it is ensuring that the very social benefits that are at the heart of the idea of the corporate form are actually achieved. And this is one of the motivating factors. We talk about it in legal language as saying not only should business not harm rights, we call that negative obligations, but business should actually positively contribute to the achievement of fundamental rights. And it has huge power, in fact, to do that. So I do agree with you, there is not necessarily an oppositional relationship, and many people try and also make the case that actually sometimes businesses that actually in the long term violate rights, they actually are unsuccessful. Right? So
can you give us an example of some of these different categories?
Let's have a look at that kind of argument. So, for example, today, many people want to work. If you're looking at attracting top employees, people don't particularly want to work for companies that are known to be serious violators of fundamental rights, right? So you can have a positive kind of encouragement of business to actually adopt good practices because people actually want to be proud of the business with which they operate. You also have a situation where, let's say, take mining companies, right? Mining companies that operate and over time create serious harms in the environment. They often have massive social protests against them. And in the book, I mentioned an example, for example, in Bougainville, which is in Papua New Guinea, where actually the company is not able to continue operating, right? So on the one hand, it thinks it can exploit for a while the materials and operate in a socially irresponsible way. Eventually, it's not able to actually operate at all because what we call often a social license to operate, the fact that people actually buy into the company operating is something that is lost. And so ultimately what happens is business that in the long term operates against the community actually has a backlash against the community. And so there are arguments like this which are important, and many people argue that it's in business's long-term interest, right, to actually operate in a way that's respectful of human rights. The problem is, of course, that directors today may not be the directors tomorrow, and a lot of the incentives and the way in which business operates is short-term. So if I can make a short-term profit in a way which may be violative of rights, I may not always think in the longer term. So what you said is right, that one can try and align these two things, but they don't always align with the current way in which business and directors are incentivized. But directors are incentivized by what the market capitalization or how the share price is tomorrow, okay, or in the next quarter or the next 6 months. And that then leads to short-term decision-making. And so one of the ways to counteract that is to create strong legal framework within which one has to operate.
Well, let's talk about that legal framework because you've talked about the limitations on states being either willing or able to limit the power of business. How is the international community at this? What about meta-state bodies? Are they any better at this?
Well, this is one of the issues that actually at the international level, the focus has very much been on regulating states and their violations of rights, right? And we know that the international community is far from perfect in relation to states alone. But the big issues that have arisen in the last 50 years, for instance, has been the growth of what we call non-state actors. So we've seen that in the realm of civil wars, we've seen that in the realm of ISIS, etc. How does the international law deal with something that's not a state? And this is another part of that question, which is a question of how do businesses which cross borders, right? I talked about that before. How are they bound by international rights? And some of the traditional lawyers would have said they're not bound at all. I think that's a mistake because if we go back, and this is very interesting being in Tel Aviv, if we go back to the foundations of the human rights regime, we know that it was in the wake of the Holocaust. And we know that in the Holocaust, there were 3 companies, there were a number actually, but 3 main ones, Krupp, IG Farben, and Flick, and they used forced labor. They did the most terrible things, essentially worked people to death. And in the wake of that, a number of the directors were prosecuted at Nuremberg. The companies themselves were not held to account. But in the minds of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Fundamental Rights could not but have been the notion that it's not only the state that can violate rights, it is also other entities. And so for me, there's actually a responsibility flowing from that origin, from the recognition that human rights are not just vulnerable to the state. They are vulnerable to strong actors in other fora, to strong individuals too, that we have to find a way to make those regimes effective. Now, what's happened in that regard, right? You asked me the question. There has, since the 1970s, been some attempt to hold corporations to account. In the 1990s, an initiative which took about 12 years failed. Then there were attempts to create voluntary frameworks, essentially, where corporations would voluntarily agree to be bound by human rights. And perhaps the most famous one, some of your listeners might know, is called the UN Global Compact, right? Where companies sign up to 10 principles which they say they will follow. But there's no real mechanism for ensuring that they really follow those principles.
So we've got a voluntary buy-in system and no means of enforcement. How effective has that been?
Yeah.
Well, this is correct. And also when you have strong incentives not necessarily to follow those systems, so you have an incentive to say, I'm a great company, but actually in your operations, you might have incentives not to follow all those principles. There was an attempt to create binding regulation in the early 2000s, and that failed in a big dispute between developing countries and developed countries.
Yeah, let's guess which side was against it.
Yeah, and this is very interesting.
No, tell our listeners.
And which side won?
Yeah.
Yeah, the developed countries, the countries that say they are standard bearers for human rights, United States, Europe, all against. And the developing countries, right, often which are the most critiqued countries, are the countries that were more in favor. And this
just to clarify again, the developed countries were against binding resolutions.
Exactly, actually binding law, right, binding human rights and having businesses bound. This continues, and there's an initiative that continues, which eventuates in something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this is, again, it's not binding, but it's established some kind of principles in sense to guide businesses. And all countries agreed on this, but again, it wasn't binding, and it's relatively weak, and it relatively is quite minimal in what it requires. And so there's been an initiative since 2014 by my own government, South Africa and Ecuador, to actually create a binding treaty, an agreement between states that provides clear guidance to states as well as businesses on what they may or may not do, and enables victims of human rights violations to claim remedies. And that at the moment has been discussed for 3 years. I have just heard that there was an acceptance that they're going to move into a further discussion this year in October in Geneva. And it is still caught in some of that politics. So the United States at the moment under Trump is not interested at all. We see Europe very weak on this. And it's very strange. As I
Europe, which, is such a great spokesbody for human rights.
But for business first.
This is very hard to understand. And as I say, I just want to go back to the point I made. I think Europe has a moral responsibility, a strong moral responsibility following from the Holocaust to take a firm position and actually go for this treaty.
I want to ask you about the human rights themselves. I mean, we mentioned a couple of examples that pertain to environmental law, the one in the West Bank and the one that you mentioned in the book, the copper mining company in Papua New Guinea. Other than pollution and the terrible effects that it has on people's basic human rights to health and happy living and whatever, what are the other aspects that this may apply to? I don't know. Were you thinking about, Facebook with tapping into people's privacy and selling it off to the highest bidder and stuff like that? I mean, there's so many examples and so many directions this could be taken, right?
Gilad, businesses affect us in all our lives today, right? In all aspects of our lives. So the most obvious area where we are often affected by business is labor rights, right? We work for corporations and we're affected by labor rights. That has a long history already of, to some extent, being regulated. Still not perfect, still lots of trouble with issues around labor. But that would be many people's strong interaction. As you mentioned, technology. Many people don't think when I send information via my phone, we have privatized a lot of our lives, right? This goes through servers. There's a mobile operator. There are, if you're using Facebook or Twitter, there are companies that are behind that. So all our lives in many ways today, a lot of us are using computers all the time, and much of what we do is actually in the hands of private corporations, right? And then potentially the state as well. So like you say, there's issues of privacy, there's issues of free speech, right? What happens, for example, if a corporation says you may not express your opinions on Twitter or on Facebook or at all, right? Beyond the company on any social media forum, right? Today, given the importance of social media, that would be quite a severe restriction in relation to our free speech. It's then got to do with health and safety, of course. It's got to do, we talked about pollution. And then it's got to do not just with harms, as I was talking about earlier, but also the ways in which corporations can help advance human rights. Myself being from a developing country, I see the very powerful effect that corporations can play. So to give you an example, there were in a number of corporations in South Africa, there were women who were employed. It was traditionally women, this is very gendered, but to make tea essentially in the corporation for people who were working in that corporation. And in many cases, this was the only job for people. And if you take a country like South Africa, there's about 40% unemployment. Now, what happens when this is based on an exact case, a new owner comes into the corporation and says, well, these people are inessential. We'll get a coffee machine, we'll get an urn, people can make their own tea and coffee. And essentially what happens is they cut those jobs. That corporation acts in a rather heartless way. It reduces its costs, but the costs are quite minimal, and the impact on people's lives are vast. So how does one integrate into corporations an understanding that they actually have a potential hugely to make impacts on people's lives. And actually in the decisions, even in those business decisions, which may affect their bottom line, they may have a duty not to advance the maximum profit and actually find ways to benefit socially.
But now I'm going to play devil's advocate. And not only am I quoting Tom Friedman in this interview, but I'm actually taking a devil's advocate position on business. I mean, is that a human rights issue? Can you really say a business doesn't have the right to fire somebody as a private entity because it's not nice or fair or easy for that person's life? Is it the business's responsibility to actually give every citizen a job or some particular citizen a job?
Well, as you say, businesses can't give every single citizen a job, of course. Right. And in the case I gave you, they already have some kind of responsibility because they already have someone in that job. And it requires a shift, right, in mindset. So it requires a shift from thinking, I can do whatever I like in the pursuit of profit, to think about, what can I do, on the one hand, to achieve my goals of profit, but also to have a strong social contribution? And if you make that shift, it might well be that it changes the balance of your decision.
But then it sounds like something other than human rights, basic human rights, to life and employment and survival and environmental conditions.
Going back to my question about campaigning.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit more like a broader concept of the social good, of how businesses contribute to the social good. Maybe this falls under corporate social responsibility. Is there an overlap? Are these categories really hard and fast, or maybe they are kind of blending together?
Yes. Well, it's an interesting question. Human rights generally relate to more basic, fundamental, strong goods. I raise that because actually in the case of like a country like South Africa, not having a job can lead you to a very severe state of affairs. People might be in Israel and Europe related more to a welfare state which provides for you well. If you fall between 18 and 59 in South Africa, there is no social assistance that you necessarily can get if you lose your job. So it can lead you into a very, very harsh state of affairs, right? And so that's why I raised it in those contexts specifically. It might be different in countries with stronger social welfare nets. As you say, I think it's good if we do think about business in a wider social way.
Don't get me wrong, me too. Don't get me wrong.
But we need to think about what is the severity of harm that we cause to people through our actions. And the example I gave you is a way I think it's important to integrate the thinking. It's not always about oppositional thinking. It's about saying, in my very business decisions, what impact do I have on fundamental rights? Do I need to have that impact on fundamental rights? What's the balance between profit and social and the social goods that are meant to achieve? And when it's human rights, they have a strong weight. And then actually to place that weight strongly in my decision making. Another example quickly is relating to this, which might be for people stronger, relates to healthcare. It relates to, again, something that happened a lot in the early 2000s relating to the availability of HIV/AIDS drugs. And people might not remember this, but at the time they were very, very expensive. And many countries, particularly developing countries, of course, but it affected other countries as well, had severe epidemic of HIV/AIDS. And if people are not treated, of course, people die. And the question then became, how are these people going to access these drugs which are available, which work, and yet they were beyond the reach of most people? And so the question that arises there is, do businesses have some kind of duty to, let's say, price their drugs at a level which doesn't essentially lead to people not being able to access them?
Ask Martin Shkreli.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. No, but I'd like to ask you, of course, you are a legal scholar and that's what you do. You deal with law and international treaties and all that. But I'd like to ask you now fairly, is it really the main avenue that this should be pursued in? Because, the law brings in all sorts of like carrots and sticks that I'm not entirely sure are really suitable here.
Gilad, it's very important that there be, as I mentioned, that there be an integration into business itself of this way of thinking. And there's been quite a lot of work in the last while to do that. There's been a lot of work to try and encourage these voluntary forums, to guide businesses, to kind of let businesses start thinking about the impact of their operations, etc. So I think some of that is happening. I don't think that is sufficient because, as I've mentioned before, the fact that business and our view of business has often prioritized profit, and because the way in which decision makers in business often have incentives essentially to take short-term decisions for the business, it's necessary to have regulation. And what we found is that there are serious gaps in international law relating to human rights where people whose rights are violated are unable to get any remedies. And this, therefore, essentially creates a strong reason to create new law it might not be totally new, as I mentioned, but actually to create clear law, at least, which ensures that individuals, that corporations are themselves bound by fundamental rights in international law, and that they know their responsibilities, and that individuals who are harmed by them can actually hold them to account.
So that should be the foundation, and on top of that, the more social aspect of that.
Absolutely. It's about creating, a treaty would be about creating a global minimum standard across the world where we say we're not going to compete on human rights violations. We're going to essentially set a global standard.
That's where profits take a second place.
Right, and that's where profits take a second place. And essentially that's the kind of treaty, and if listeners are interested in the book that we've edited, it makes concrete proposals for what should go into such a treaty.
Well, that was going to be sort of the wrap-up question. I want our listeners to get some sense of what you would propose for that kind of treaty.
So what actually goes into the treaty? We have a whole list of sort of suggestions.
Give us your top 4.
So one of the important things is to make binding what's called a due diligence duty, a duty on business to essentially consider the impact of their activities on human rights. And essentially that requires you to think about what you do in relation to fundamental rights and where you violate rights, essentially to remedy what those violations.
And to make that public?
Well, some of it might be public, some of it not public.
I was getting nervous.
Well, it depends. I mean, I think there definitely needs to be reporting as well. So as you say, I think it's very clear that the duties of directors need to be essentially to take account of issues like human rights in the decision-making of the business. So in other words, it's not just about decision-making on grounds of profit. You have to take account of the human rights impact in your decision-making itself. You need to also have the capacity to review those decisions. So I think what we need to do is have businesses who make those decisions need to be capable of being reviewed by courts in many ways. We need to ensure that there's international cooperation to address some of the gaps that exist where evidence is difficult, for example, to gather between countries. Enforcement of judgments is difficult to achieve. So we need to ensure that there's strong international cooperation, and a treaty can do that in many ways. And we need to essentially establish a mechanism, essentially to determine what the obligations of businesses are. This is a relatively new area, to actually determine those obligations so they become predictable, and then to have follow-up, right? To have actually follow-up, which can either be in the courts of other countries, and ideally, although I think this at the moment is a little bit idealistic, ideally some kind of international body that would make decisions in this area, and where all else fails, where the domestic states refuse to hold businesses to account for their harms, where you could go to as a last resort.
Good luck with all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's so exciting when states agree on things.
Note. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do optimistic stuff here on the television all the time.
We're living in a very optimistic time when a number of European Union countries have managed to agree barely on how to respond to
I don't know why people
Russia.
trash us all the time. Anyway, Professor David Bilchitz, the co-editor of Building a Treaty on Business and Human Rights, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Tritai Shalom, our producer. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request for you. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and then press write a review, and then write one.
And a big thanks to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Check out our archive with over 400 interviews, nearly 450 at this point. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.